Welcome, everyone, to the Australian Bitcoin podcast. I'm Justin, your host, and today I'm joined by DazBea from LookingGlassEducation.com to discuss his Bitcoin origin story, becoming a Bitcoin educator, Bitcoin mining, and any other tangent topics. But before we start, a quick word from our sponsor. The Australian Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by hardblock.com.au. Hardblock aims to help their users save in hard money and to become self-sovereign Bitcoiners. Hardblock has no added fees on deposit, buy, or sell transactions, so the prices are what you see are what you get. Hardblock's Bitcoin withdrawal fees are also among the cheapest in Australia, including a very low 99 sat Bitcoin withdrawal cost when using their new auto send feature. Check out Hardblock today. All right, Daz, how's it going?
Hey, Justin, thanks for having me, buddy.
No worries. Thanks for being here. Really glad to have a chat. And just to give a bit of context, I would have mentioned it at the top end of the show, but keen to talk to you about your Bitcoin journey, the Bitcoin education that you're doing with Looking Glass Education, a bit about Bitcoin mining, especially in the home context, and a couple of tangent topics that I think maybe Bitcoin's gotten you into, but otherwise has definitely gotten me into in terms of like speed reading and mind mapping and that kind of thing. Having said that, before we jump into it, I've got a piece of like news that I saw very recently, and I'm pretty sure you saw it too because I saw a Twitter post about it. And I wanted to just bring it up because I think it's just an interesting topical thing. But it's the World Economic Forum's propaganda video about Bitcoin mining. I assume like you know the one that I'm talking about.
I do. I'm familiar with it. Yes.
Like I'm just kind of flabbergasted at how, I don't know, what's the term, like jumping the shark, where they are just all out propaganda now. Don't even worry about if people can find the fact that there's, well, none of the claims that they have in the video are really supported by anything. And I don't know, like when you saw that video, was that just like I was expecting that from them? Or was it even like, did it kind of surprise you or blindside you a bit as well? I'm just amazed at how blatant it is now. It's just crazy.
I was not surprised in the least, to be honest. The more I learn about those type of organizations, it's becoming pretty evident that there's an incentive structure in place with people who are members of said organizations. So you only need to take a brief look down through the World Economic Forum members list, and you start to see some pretty familiar faces, people who are on the board of XRP, people who are on the board of Ethereum, typical shitcoiners like Meltem Demoris, I think that's her last name.
Yeah, the big blocker.
So when you have those sort of people in and amongst helping form policy and decisions that broadly go out from these organizations to governments, corporations, regulatory authorities, and so forth, it's not surprising to see that. The blatant lies, though, that go, it really does start to grate me, and it's kind of dumbfounding to me, the fact that because we're Bitcoiners and we're plugged into the system, I think we're obviously more accustomed to the sort of propaganda and lies and so forth that come out without any basis in fact. But for normies out there who are getting their information from these sort of sources, it's a really hard battle that we've got coming up. And, you know, I'm just thankful that we have very good, sound, well-communicated voices within this space to help us push these messages through, that some of this is just absolute rot. It is, it's not based in fact. And there's a clear agenda behind what they're trying to control. And for me, all that points to is the fact that Bitcoin is completely decentralized. It is beyond the control or coercion of any body, any government, any political party, any corporation. It is completely out of their control. And it also highlights to me the fact that these other quote unquote decentralized assets are not that thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole thing seemed a lot like the Greenpeace America, like Ripple. And I mean, even if you look at their partners, the World Economic Forum, Ripple is a partner, and you just think, but it's just so blatant. The thing that really pleased me, and you're right, because we do have, like, that attack is just going to increase over time. And so we do need solid foundation of education and kind of myth busting, really. But what really pleased me is that even though they have something like over 1 million followers, the entire comment section was just Bitcoiners calling out their prediction from 2017, saying by 2020, Bitcoin's going to use all the world's energy. Like a ludicrous claim that obviously hasn't come true, but it's one of their original claims. There was like Nick Carter and a few other people saying, do you know this Mora et al. Study is not actually a study? It's an undergraduate class paper. It's only 2 pages and it did no scientific research at all. And you're quoting it. Yeah. It's just like all these things, people just jumping on them for all very good reasons. And that's very reassuring when you go to the thread. There wasn't too many normies being like, yeah, Bitcoin's bad, it's using too much energy. It was all people just saying like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, how are you coming at it with these baseless claims? So that's very reassuring for me.
Exactly. And if we can take one positive out of this, the more ridiculous that they make these claims, it just, helps people to wake up and say, well, if you're lying to me about this, what else are you lying to me about? All these other policies, which we, obviously don't need to get into, but I think most people can put 2 and 2 together. They make so much policy that dictates what we do in all the governments around the world on various topics, everywhere from banking to health to finance to you name it. And I just hope that the veils are starting to lift. The more and more normies I talk to, you start to get this feeling that they just know something's not right. Yeah. And like I said, it does give me a little bit of reassurance, I guess, to echo your words, that this stuff's going to come to the chicken will come home to roost at some point, and people start to wake up to some of this, FUD, particularly about Bitcoin.
It's just a gradual erosion of that trust in the authority, basically, isn't it? Because the more and more that sort of stuff comes out, it's just, as much as it blows my mind and frustrates me, it's also like you couldn't write it any better. Like I would assume that they'd be very good at propaganda right now, and they could come out with something that is very convincing, but they don't. They come out with something that's sort of slapped together that they know is going to get shot down. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's probably all that can be said on that. Is it's ridiculous. We'll probably see a lot more of it, but I'm very glad that people are waking up to it. And they've just, they've sort of shot themselves in the foot by having more and more and more blatant lies, which people catch on to very quickly, which is,
But perhaps we have some Trojan horses of our own in amongst dropping. We should say this sort of thing just because they know it's so blatantly wrong.
Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't be surprised. Like if that came out eventually to say there were some people in there that were saying like, they'll eat this up. They'll, everyone will believe this. And we've got the great way to pump it on social media, and all the big wigs are like, yeah, this sounds great. Let's do that. Let's kill Bitcoin. Let's make it go to proof of stake. That will change the code. And then the people doing it know for sure everyone's going to jump on.
It's never going to happen.
Exactly right. This will be the self-destruct. Oh, crazy. Well, thank you for humoring me on that tangent. I just figured it's a bit of a topical thing that's been on my mind today, so I wanted to have a quick chat about it before we really kick things off.
Absolutely.
So we might as well start with your Bitcoin journey. And I'm aware that you've done some of the podcast rounds recently and even in the sort of distant past, so I don't feel like you need to go into all the detail, but perhaps like some main touch points of like what really, put you onto Bitcoin, any kind of memorable moments or people or readings that you've done. Yeah,
sure. So I did come from to Bitcoin from the finance angle. Kind of summarizing a long story short, I always worked for wages and never really had any investments, never really even enjoyed savings. And I'm now in my just turned 40. So just going back into my 20s, into my early 30s, I never really had money. So I never really knew the value of investing because it was just something that, we grew up. My father was a factory worker. My mother was a cafeteria worker. We never had money. I never grew up knowing what it was like to be wealthy or rich. Not that we ever starved or anything. They provided a very good life for me and my brothers and sisters. But, it was just one of those things that if you don't know there's a problem, you don't know there's a problem. It's, you don't know what you don't know. And it was only when I sort of hit my 30s that I decided to take a career shift. I just wanted to be an electrician. And with that has come this realization that, the more, when you're not working a salary job and you're working for an hourly rate, it was something I never really put 2 and 2 together about the more I put in the more I can take out. So it was all about that reward for effort. And when you work for salary, and whether you work 30 hours or 40 hours or 60 hours and you get paid the same, that incentive structure is not really there. And I didn't realize it was missing until I'd flipped that career change. And so all of a sudden I started making good money. Then I've always been an avid self-educator. So at sort of the age of 30 as well, I went and did a university degree. And I was used to working full-time, studying part-time, and that entailed about 20 hours of effort in the study space per week in order to keep on top of things. And I was a pretty disciplined student. And so when I'd finished up those formal studies, I was used to putting that 20 hours in a week of study. So I'm like, okay, now what do I do? Channel that energy into something, to further myself, further my development, further, basically better yourself, better your standing in life. And sort of put two and two together. When I was actually making good money, I thought I'm going to channel all that energy into learning how to invest. So I sort of come to the realization with a little bit of help from starting to read some books and started to look at a few things about, just looking at your incentive to save in a bank was you're getting no interest. So, you put that money away and it just doesn't grow. It doesn't do anything, doesn't work for you. So I thought, okay, I need to invest it. I can't just save it in the bank. So I started reading everything I could on investing. So I started just reading books, and reading's a passion of mine, which I'm sure, as you touched on, we'll talk a bit about speed reading and so forth later, which I later developed, but just absorbed as much as I could in relation to investing. And I fully bought into that value investing mindset about Warren Buffett's the most famous, value investor in history. And his number one rule is don't lose money. And that was something that I said, wow, I didn't even realize that was something investors really focused on. And that resonated really well with me. If I can learn how to do that and not lose money, that's winning. And sort of fast forward, I read how to, I learned how to value stocks. So I thought, a couple of the things I sort of realized along that journey was, how do you know what you're paying for a stock? When you go and buy a share in one of these, blue chip stocks, how do I know if that's paying too much, if it's fair value, or, I didn't even at that time realize what that word fair value meant. So again, it was another learning journey on basically reading balance sheets. And the analogy I like to use for people who aren't familiar with that space is, if you were to go and buy a coffee shop, your corner coffee shop, you're going to want to know how many cups of coffee they're selling, how much the stock costs, how much their overheads, their wages are, their electricity, their rent, and you're going to want to know how much profit. Why is that any different when you're looking to buy a share? Because basically when you buy a share in a company, you are buying a fraction of the ownership of that company. So if you were to go and buy a whole coffee shop, you're going to do that due diligence to make sure that's a good business to buy. You should be doing the same thing when you buy a stock. The problem that arose for me was I had all these valuation metrics, and I put them all in a spreadsheet, and I had all of the companies in the ASX 200, and I pulled all their data in manually. And then I used to use the Google Finance lookup calculations, and it would pull the price data in for me. And I would just keep an eye on that for anything that was worthwhile purchasing that was deemed fair value by these valuation metrics. And the problem was there was nothing to buy. So with that realization, I'm like, either I'm doing something wrong or there's something wrong with my calculations. And of course, I was just pointing towards me, not realizing at the time there was nothing wrong with what I was doing. There's something fundamentally wrong with the system. And the thing that I tweaked that was wrong was interest rates and the cost of capital and the cost to borrow money for these large corporations. Everything feeds off the interest rate. And Preston Pish was obviously his Investors podcast series is absolutely phenomenal for piecing together exactly that same same fundamental things I've been talking about with the intrinsic value of a stock and reading their balance sheets and all this sort of thing. And that realization journey, learning along with their podcast, and he also writes some phenomenal books for investors that I highly recommend anybody goes out and gets. And it was his realization into that the system was broken as well. And I was kind of able to go along that journey with him as he's realizing, he's peeling back the layers, And one of those layers that he comes to was Bitcoin. And sort of that's where the penny dropped for me. And he's had some really excellent guests on in the past, like Turdemeester and Eric Townsend had a debate. Eric Townsend's a pro digital currency, but not Bitcoin advocate. Turdemeester's been in the space a very long time, and they had a very, very good debate about the benefits of all. And I was listening to that sort of before I was a Bitcoiner and going, you know what? Tur had him. You know, all of Tur's points sort of resonated with me. And then he had Saifedean Ammous, who's written a phenomenal book, The Bitcoin Standard. It's kind of like every Bitcoiner's recommended reading. And I can't back that up enough, because that was the book that I read along with Rothbard's, I forget the name of the book, actually. It's something about banking and money. Read those two books, and that's what formulated my worldview about what is money. And that's really the journey that I took to find Bitcoin, and come to the realization out of studying basically all the iterations of money throughout time, that Bitcoin was a pristine form of money that satisfies all of the main properties that I was able to identify. And those books just lay it out really well.
Absolutely. It sounds like you've had a lot of that Austrian economics influence, obviously, from like the Rothbard books and Saifedean. And I'm sure that's, kind of prevalent in Preston Pisher's podcast as well, and value investing, of course, there too.
Yeah, without really labeling it at the time. The Austrian Economic Convention, the naming convention, didn't really dawn on me until a little bit later on in that journey. So it was kind of, I come across it without knowing what it was. And then later on, obviously, fully resonating with what that means.
Yeah, that's right. Like even your own personal journey kind of took on board those philosophies, probably without realizing that they were, a specific philosophy to take on, like going from salaried to then paid per hour, and knowing like I can get paid for the amount of effort that I put in, and then saying, actually, I want to have some free time so I can leverage my time and upskill myself, so then I can maybe earn passive investment so I don't have to work as much, like kind of taking that essentially a proof of work type approach.
Yeah, it's probably only upon reflection from what I know now to looking back to that journey that I've been able to piece that together. It wasn't something I, really realized at the time. But it's one of those natural incentives that it's human nature. It's praxeology. It's, what you put in, we're all incentivized to do better by ourselves, So if you're in an environment where doesn't matter what you put in, you're going to get the same back out, you're just naturally going to work to the bottom. You're going to see, well, I'm incentivized to not perform. How much can I get away with actually not working? And if I can just expand on that a little bit, I know with your background, it was when I worked for salary in the job that I was working, I was the most depressed I've ever been in my life. And there was just no drive. And I was incentivized to do as little as possible. And that was a really, really soul crushing experience. Looking back now, where you're in a funk and you were incentivized to do as little as possible, but then you were putting undue pressure onto yourself because you knew you had a certain expectation to perform. Contrast that now with I absolutely love my job, and I put in 110%, and it just reflects on everything, your whole demeanor while you're at work. If you're getting rewarded for your effort, and it's recognized and it's incentivized, it just creates a way better work environment, and you're more prone to enjoy yourself while you're doing it.
Absolutely. Like we like to see ourselves as being pretty complicated humans, and I guess we are. But at the same time, if you look at behavioral modification for an animal, like for a dog, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, timeouts, those sort of things, it all still counts for us. So if you're in a system whereby the culture is to do relatively very little, and the things that you do work on might get like shelved or put on hold and never come to fruition, and you don't get in trouble for that, and you keep getting rewarded actually no matter how much work you do or don't do, it just makes sense to kind of sandbag. And I worked in state government for almost a decade before getting into psychology and then getting into Bitcoin. So I completely understand where you're coming from. It was soul crushing. And most people, if I would explain what I did, would be like, wow, that sounds really great. I'm like, no, it's not. It's great for about 2 or 3 months. And then you know how to do everything really well. But like, no one wants you to do that stuff really well. You can work on a project for years, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, the minister's changed. We're going to stop that project now, and maybe we'll come back to it later on. You just think, that's what a waste of my time. And I could just see this trajectory just getting worse and worse and worse the higher in the ranks that I went. And then I thought, I'm going to be the one soon telling people to stop this useful work that they're doing and basically facilitating all this stuff that I hate. So yeah, I'm right there with you, man. Once you move into something where you get paid for your time and you feel like you're delivering more meaning and value and you have more autonomy over that too, it's like you can't put a price on that, really.
It's exactly. And you can draw the same conclusions with money and saving. So if you are in this job where you just get, you're not enjoying yourself, you're just going there to pay the bills, and then anything you are able to squirrel away and put away is not buying you anything. There's no incentive structure for you to continue on that path. So the incentive exists for you to go and spend every cent of it, and if you can go and buy an extra carton of beer and get that little buzz on the weekend, that's what you're going to do. And this has developed this whole mentality in society, and probably leads to a lot of the depression and stuff we experience in society, is the fact that our money doesn't work. Our money, if you are able to save $100 a week and you put it in the bank, but it's just going to erode away through inflation over time, it's not going to grow and it's not going to buy you anything in the long term, where's the incentive?
Absolutely. And it's really just comes down to the lottery of when you get born. Like, I think my generation is probably the last lucky generation in terms of being able to just save legitimate just dollars and get a house deposit and get a house. Whereas the generation after me it's just not possible anymore unless you are born into some level of wealth. And of course, you go back another generation, and it was easier to do that. But that's just literally the genetic lottery of waking up and going, okay, I'm in this particular era. The money's not completely fucked yet, but give it another couple revolutions and it will be.
And then you contrast that along with the age lottery, it's the location in the geopolitical lottery
True.
as well. And and when you contrast that to, we've got it so much better than these other countries, and it's just mind-boggling to sort of sit there and realize how hard people have it as slaves to the system, earning wages.
And they're locked into it as well. Like, there is essentially no way out unless they transition to a parallel economy like Bitcoin. And even 100%. Your journey of having to figure out value investments and looking through all the stocks and going, there's literally nothing here. Like, if these were all coffee shops, I wouldn't buy them, basically. And we shouldn't have to do that with money. Like, of course, when you've learned the history of money, you start to realize like that this is meant to help us specialize. This is meant to help us just save our energy, essentially, that we've converted into something useful, and to not have to go gamble or to be a stock guru or to know about all geopolitics and currency and trading and everything. Like, you don't need to have to do that. Well, you do in current society, but we shouldn't have to with good money. And yeah, discovering that just makes so much sense once it clicks.
Well, wealth protection shouldn't mean you have to go so far out on the risk curve. And that's the difference between what our parents and grandparents had as far as living in high interest rate environments where money wasn't manipulated, to today, where you are forced to go further and further out on that risk curve in search for not just yield, for income. It's just to protect yourself against inflation.
Yeah, that's right. Now it's not even about making wealth. It's just about not having your savings be eroded over time. And this is
100%.
It's Weimar Republic stuff, isn't it? Like, all the people around me are getting into stocks, they're getting into crypto, but just specifically for trading, getting into leverage trading. And none of these people are gamblers. But when I try to put it on the parallels, like, this is just gambling, you realize that, no, I've got a system, or I follow this guy on Twitter and he's been right most of the time. And you think, okay, you will learn that it's just gambling. But it's normalized now. This is the culture of, we're all, savvy investors nowadays. Not really. We're just forced to, well, I say we, but you know what I mean? The normies are really forced to play the stock market to try to get ahead in that way.
There's a lot of correlation with Weimar Germany. People think we're far away from it, and there's some good arguments to support why that's the case. But there are also some pretty high, scary correlation to the events that unfolded leading up to that and during that hyperinflation.
Well, hyperinflation, I know sometimes we get caught up on the technicals of saying like it needs to be 50% per month or something along those lines. And, it's the system is a lot more complicated than what we give it credit for. But I do think Bitcoiners are directionally accurate, aren't they? Like we know it's either heading to some level of hyperinflation, whether it reaches that criteria or not, or some sort of deflationary spiral and a debt collapse. I guess the tricky part is the timing. When does that happen exactly, which no one can really know.
That's right. And like, I was just trying to see if I could find this tweet just to get the facts and figures 100% in front of mine. But like, we don't even have to be achieving the quote unquote hyperinflation, whatever the economists of the time deem that to be, in order for us to experience some pretty horrific wealth destruction. So all you have to do is just look at just compounding inflation rates. I think it's something like as low as 10% can erode your wealth within. I'm going to misquote it, so I won't do it any justice, but injustice rather. So I encourage everybody. It's probably a good segue into the platform, but we do have some pretty good examples in our education course, just highlighting some, like, you don't have to be experiencing double-digit inflation for that to destroy purchasing power. Single-digit inflation can and will destroy your purchasing power over time and any hope you have of savings. And it's it's the fact that we are experiencing double-digit inflation where we really need to start, lifting our game and helping our friends and family to start to realize what this is potentially doing to them.
Yeah, it's so true, because you're right. We're really already in Australia, especially if you look at property prices, store of value type assets, we're already at double-digit inflation. And the idea of hyperinflation being 50% every month, like, that's really bad. Like, if we get to that point, we're like, it's already done essentially up until that point. Because you're right,
Absolutely.
Even just having single-digit inflation, America's at 8.5% now. That's the lowest they could get it down to. That within 10 years, you've lost essentially the majority of your wealth. I think it's more like 8 or 9 years, like you say, with compounding inflation. That's very kind of back of the napkin maths, but 8 or 9 years, that's essentially all of your purchasing power gone. Like, imagine if you're retiring at 65, you got to live another 20 years. You get like 7 or 8 years in, and then you need to start selling assets or getting a government pension and living kind of just like on scrapes. It's ridiculous. People do need to know more about this and realize, like, even the difference between nominal and real yield, because sometimes people will still say, oh, you can get 1% in the bank, or you can get a certain percent with, stocks or bonds. You think, yeah, but what's the real yield? That's just the percent that they tell you that you're going to get. But if you count in inflation, you're losing 4 or 5% per year, or even up to like 10 or 15% per year.
Exactly. And even if we're going to quote the CPI inflation figures, like you pointed out, it's still having a negative impact. And then if you have a look at your own personal basket of goods, which is another really important point to highlight, is everyone's inflation basket's different. Everyone experiences inflation at different rates, depending on what you've got going on in your life. If you're old and need healthcare and, more than, say, somebody's younger, your inflation rate's going to be, a lot different than somebody in their teens. They might not be experiencing inflation because their parents still buy them groceries. They're still living at home. They might have their own car, and they're starting to see the increase in gas prices and so forth. But if you're a single mom and you've got to send your kids to school, and you've got fuel costs, it's just mind-boggling to think the impacts on various people. And what I can guarantee is that what we experience from day to day is way underreported by those CPI prints.
Well, when you can manipulate the basket of goods, and it's within your interest to keep your job and to get elected next time, to have everything as low as possible, the incentives are all wrong. Like, if you just look at it from an engineering perspective, like a systems engineer, you would say, this is going to have bad outcomes. It doesn't matter how good the outcomes seem initially. This is going to lead to bad outcomes. From an evolutionary perspective, we will triangulate to like the path of least resistance, where we get the most reward. And if it's allowed, in fact, it's encouraged in these systems, it makes sense why it keeps happening.
The most dangerous thing to the CPI basket and that manipulation is these hedonic adjustments, where they say, a steak used to cost $10 a steak, for example, but you know what, you can get the same protein from a really cheap processed soy burger, so we'll just substitute. I mean, that's probably a drastic example, but it's the sort of adjustments that are made, where they look at, if you can get the same amount of protein for something that costs $2, then we'll just substitute that in the basket of goods, because it's your choice if you want to eat the steak.
That's right. Safety goes into that a little bit in the fiat standard, which is really good because there's been points in history where that example is not that far-fetched. It has happened before. And when you start to look at, I mean, get into seed oils, that's a pretty big tangent, but you just look at being sold industrial waste as food, and someone would say, well, why would that happen? Because, clearly that's going to be bad for us. Like, well, the incentives aren't to make us sick, although maybe there's some incentives there as well, because that props up the healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, and that's a broken incentive too. However, I guess the main point is it lowers CPI, basically. Inferior goods just like pushes the prices down. And so it wasn't probably about making us unhealthy. It was about making sure the prices stay low, and it's repurposing something that otherwise would be thrown out. And then, of course, if it does make us unhealthy and then we start using the services more and become more reliant on the government, I mean, that's all incentivized in quotations, correct way for now.
That's exactly right. And that Fiat Standard is another amazing book. Highly recommend the read. It's a long one, but it's definitely worth the effort. There's so many examples there as well where the incentive has existed for the Fiat Standard, our ability to print money to go and buy the outcomes that we want in science, which is a pretty mind-boggling concept for most, not sort of clued into the system where those things exist. And there's a couple of good examples in that book that just illustrate how easy that is for some of these large corporations. For example, if you do have, I'll just use an example. Say you're Kellogg's and you have a processing plant and you have, some byproducts of a process where, hang on, if we stamp that into a little thing and call it a cornflake, perhaps, there needs to be a market for that. But how do we get that into everybody's diet? Well, let's just approach a university, for example, and we could say, we've got $3 million. We want $1 million of this $3 million to come out and produce a paper that suggests that this is pretty good for you. And someone will say, the first university will say, oh, that goes beyond our ethics. The second university will say, oh, that goes beyond our ethics. But how many do you need to approach before one will go, we can see how, and it doesn't even have to be that a blatant lie. It's all about looking at data and looking at ways that you can manipulate. And there's another really good book I highly recommend everyone read. It doesn't really give you anything groundbreaking, but it's How to Lie with Statistics. And it just gives you some really good, entertaining examples of how you can get a data set and manipulate it and look at it in different ways to tell different stories. And that's basically all science is an interpretation of data. And if that's not challenged, then all you have is basically a governing or an authoritative body that says, based on our pedigree and the data that we've observed, here's an outcome. And if it's not challenged, then that's fact until proven otherwise.
And it's so difficult to dethrone a concept or a theory or a fact in quotations that has been validated a couple of times. It just becomes this reigning thing for decades, usually, until it gets overturned. Well, but we've seen it so many times, especially things like the opioid crisis, many different medications and surgeries and stuff that we do that are really not that useful for things like chronic pain, for example, and make the whole situation worse. And there's almost been about 50 or 60 years worth of research proving that they make it worse, but it's just very slow to actually work its way down into the practical realm. And when you mentioned statistics, I actually really liked quantitative statistics in psychology, but because of the reason that you said, because you get a data set and you're like, okay, to do this particular analysis that I need to do, this data is meant to be normally distributed, but it's not normally distributed. That's okay. You can do a logarithmic transformation, and now it looks normally distributed. Cool. Now I can run my analysis. You run your analysis. You go, I didn't find anything significant. What if instead of just doing all the aggregate data, I break it down into age groups? Okay, this one's looking a bit more significant. Okay, what if I take the variables and I actually break them down into certain ranges as well and test each one of those through? Now I found some significant, now I can write a report. This is great. But that's not how you're meant to do science. You're meant to start with the theory in mind that you're trying to test, not go on a fishing expedition and go I've changed the data, not like actually changing the data itself, but I've changed the statistical analysis that you might use or the way that it's clustered or grouped. And now I found something and I can report on that. And then someone else uses that as a reference of why they're going to do their study. And then the whole thing just goes on and on and on.
That's exactly right. So it's citation after citation to reaffirm what was originally found. And that's never challenged unless there is funding brought forth to specifically challenge, in most cases, I'm not going to say that's in all cases, but in most cases, there needs to be, most of these universities, or hazard of fact that all of these universities work off a grant-based system where, Seyfriedin highlights in that book that a lot of these academics, these professors and PhDs are basically just professional grant writers applying applications for grants. And that's basically how they're interviewed. It's like, well, we know you're pretty good and you know your stuff, but how good are you at writing a grant application just to get the funding to pursue their studies?
Their KPIs are based around publications, not about their teaching or the quality of the students that leave their classes. It's about how much do you publish. And if you need money to publish, you need to get grants. You need to be in good with industry. You need to be in good with government. And whatever the agenda of the industry and the government is, which is usually relatively aligned, you need to be aligned with that too. Otherwise, you don't get the grants, you don't get the publications, you don't get the job. It's
100%.
Again, the incentives are broken, but it makes total sense why we end up in this place, not even out of people being malicious or malignant. It's just
you could imagine the university. Sorry to cut you off.
That's okay.
You can imagine the University of Queensland coming out tomorrow, or rather, you could never imagine the University of Queensland coming out tomorrow and saying, you know what, this ESG stuff, we're not buying. That just would never happen because, like you said, that can be completely bastardized by every single media outlet possible, and you could pretty much sign your fate. You'll never get another grant again.
That's it. And also then be labeled, I don't know, and
right
climate, yeah, whatever it is that they're saying.
Pro-Trump.
Which of the ESG, exactly right. It would be right-wing, neo-Nazi, extremist, climate denier, something along those lines.
Slap every label we can.
That's it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, education, this is a good segue because this is part of the solution, isn't it? Like letting people know that these things do exist, not even needing to come up with, what's the word, like intentions or reasons or motives. I guess it's just more like saying, hey, look, this exists. But there's this parallel system and these parallel philosophies and this hard money standard that exists that actually stops a lot of these things happening. So I'm curious, like, how did it all kind of come about, Looking Glass Education? Because I've seen that first course that you guys have up, which is about 3 hours, pitched at the different sort of investment vehicles that people might choose, history of money, things about inflation. And then I like how it just sort of sprinkles Bitcoin in there, but doesn't really just, slam Bitcoin as the thing. But I'm curious, like, how did that come about, like that idea and even that course itself?
So something that it was a bit of an evolution. So if we can step back to, I think it was around April 2021. So I was pretty much down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I was probably still a little bit of shitcoining by that stage. But I was on my way to fall down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And I was having a lot of these discussions with mainly my friends. I work in a depot of about 40 blokes. We're all very similar skills. We do very similar jobs. We earn very similar money, and we're in very similar states of our lives. And we are in a lucky situation where we do have a little bit of disposable income to be looking at investment and so forth. So most of these guys are pretty savvy with money and spending and all that sort of stuff. And I just noticed I was having a ton of conversations about, you guys don't actually realize, you think you guys are pretty across it, but what I'm finding out about the money situation is blowing my mind, and it's only getting worse because we were right in amongst COVID. There was money printing going hand over fist, and the writing was on the wall that this was going to get really, really bad. And I was having these conversations and started to have, because we always work in separate little crews, so I'm always dealing with probably one, if maximum sort of 4 of those 40 people at any one time, and we sort of rotate through. So I'm having a lot of that same conversation. It's really sharpening my sword with the messaging. And so anyway, that big sharp drop, we had the China mining ban, and then Bitcoin puked. And it was like, I wrote an article to say, it was mainly due to send out to my friends and family to say, don't shit the bed here. This is okay. We're going to be okay. And here's why. And it was mainly I was doing a bit of trading and so forth. And I started to look at some of those institutional order flows and some of the sell-off, and it was clear to me that this was a little bit of a leverage trading washout with all these dumps. I was sort of consolidating and a dump, consolidating and a dump, consolidating and a dump, getting people comfortable. And that's where I wrote the first article. And I got some really good feedback from my friends and family. And I went, you know what? I've done this enough times now where, as I said, I've sharpened that sword enough. I think I could probably put a lot of this in writing. And I'll just start stripping out some of the shit, some of the jargon, some of the industry stuff that's put there, I would argue, purposefully to obfuscate the message to normal people. And I thought I will just start breaking down, and I'll introduce a couple of different financial concepts. So I started off with inflation. Here's what inflation is. And then at the end of each piece, I'd put Bitcoin in. Here's how Bitcoin talks to that particular issue and how it potentially fixes it. Next one was fiat currency and a little history of money and so forth. And I got really good feedback. So I shared them on social media. I started getting some really good feedback from the Bitcoin community to say, hey, mate, you're doing a pretty good job with these articles. You know, they're very, my whole goal was to make it accessible to as many people as possible, and particular wage earners. So that's always been my focus. And I wrote one on bonds, and I sent that to Greg Foss. So for anyone new to the space, Greg Foss is a Canadian risk manager. He's been trading risk for over 30 years. And he's a bit of a Bitcoin celebrity. He's very popular. He gets on, he goes on epic rants. He's just a lovely bloke, and I can guarantee he's as genuine a bloke in real life as you see on those podcasts. He's just a hilarious guy, and he gets really passionate, and he's really passionate about Bitcoin. And I sent him this bond article to say, I'm just about to put this out. Can you just run your eye over it and make sure I've got it right? Because there was a bit of bond math in there, and I just didn't want to be putting something out that wasn't in my wheelhouse. I wasn't a bond expert, but I'd pieced enough together through my macro journey to say, okay, I've got something to offer here. And he said, it's absolutely perfect, and I wouldn't change anything, which was just such great feedback to get from a legend like that. And it wasn't too long after that, Jason Sansoni, he's a surgeon in Wisconsin in the States. He'd contacted Greg to say, Greg, I love listening to your podcast, but half the time I don't understand what the hell you're talking about. I think there's an opportunity to distill some of what you're saying. And he said, I've got the perfect bloke for you. And he put us together. And that's sort of where the Looking Glass stepped off. And then slowly over time, Greg being he's just a great networker, and people contact him out of the blue for a lot of different things. And then just over the course of the next couple of months, Jason and I were starting to piece together what we sort of looked for the Looking Glass, just trying to establish the bookends on what was the target market we were trying to look at, and different ways, just what we were going to capture and what we were going to limit ourselves to, because Bitcoin touches on so many points. And one of the really big pieces of feedback I got through all those articles was like, I really like what you're saying, but you're a bit heavy on the Bitcoin. Particularly if I was sending it to friends and family who weren't into Bitcoin or cryptocurrency and still deemed it risky. So what we decided to do from the outset was try and put a Bitcoin course out there that wasn't about Bitcoin, and allow the people, give the evidence, and just put that learning journey sort of that most of us went on. If you're coming up from a finance angle, where you start to learn about what is money, how that fits into the financial landscape, where the artificial suppression of interest rates, how that affects the economy and how it affects you as a person earning wages, and tried to piece it together in a way that allowed people to come to the natural conclusion of Bitcoin without shoving Bitcoin down their throats. Because as soon as you introduce Bitcoin, you'll turn off still a good percentage, I would argue a high percentage of people, because it's still in your face, but there's still a message in there. Whether you choose Bitcoin to protect yourself or not, you still need to be aware that the system's screwed. There's major issues here. There are options you can do. We just happen to think Bitcoin's a really, really good one.
That's it's a good way of putting it. And you got to really be careful with your scope, don't you? Because we can include too much stuff in there, and almost just needing to go back, put ourselves in other people's shoes and say, like, where was I when I started this journey, and what really got me to understand it? And you can actually divorce Bitcoin from that learning and then introduce it towards the end, or even introduce it as one of many potential solutions, I think we'll find over time there's not many other solutions, but people will work their way to that naturally. And that is a better way for people to learn. It's a bit more self-guided. So yeah, I think what you've done is really good in just the way that it introduces things in just a nice systematic way, but starts from the ground up. And it's something that I'll be giving to friends and family. And I've already sent the link around, but I know what a lot of people are like. They're like, oh, I need information. You send them information. They drop off the face of the earth. And then they come back in like 2 or 3 weeks and like, oh, the price is up. What's going on? Like, did you read that thing? No, I didn't read the thing. But either way, like that'll be my go-to to say like, this is almost your prerequisite. Like you just need to chip away at this because it introduces it in a very friendly manner. It tells you at least what the problem is. So even if you don't believe Bitcoin's a solution, at least you're aware of what the problem is and you can start doing something about it. So yeah, I think the way you've gone about it is perfect.
Oh, I appreciate it. And that was probably, you raised a good point. Not a lot. That was good feedback that I got when I first released my articles was, mate, good effort, but that's a 29-minute read on bonds. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not interested in that. So we decided early on as well that we would record all that content. So it's available on Apple Pod, Spotify, and Anchor, and also on Fountain app. You can stream sats to us if you prefer to do it that way. And so it was just another way of making that more accessible to people who particularly don't like. Not everyone likes to read. Not a lot of people can read. Like I talk to a lot of friends. Reading puts them to sleep. It's just not something they're physically able to do because I don't know whether that's just they haven't done it enough in their life and it just will put them to sleep within 5 minutes. So we thought if we just record it, I mean, you've got to put up with this larrikin's Aussie drawl throughout it because I narrate it, some of it myself. Seb Bunny, our other co-author of the course, he narrates it and I've got my wife doing the introduction and conclusion. So, but it's just another way of making that accessible. And we do have no immediate plans, but we are looking at some just different ways we can leverage that a bit further with some video content and so forth. We are also, so just speaking, I sort of skipped over, we had some more people come in. So there's 7 of us in the platform, involved in the platform now. So there's myself, Seb Bunny. We were the main co-authors of the course itself. Jason Sansoni writes some phenomenal articles doing exactly that. So we've got 2 sections in the platform. One's the specific course, which takes you through. But throughout the course as well, we introduce a few concepts. And at the end of each module, we have some recommended readings. If something tweaks your interest, you go, you know what, that's interesting. I wouldn't mind learning a bit more about that. We've got a deep dive section within there as well, which will break down some of these concepts. I host my articles there. Jason Sansoni's got a really good 3-piece bonds. If bonds have always been one of those things you want to know about, all the complex math that goes in behind it, he's done a 3-piece article on that. Also really lucky to have James Lavish on. He is another US-based risk manager. He's got over 25 years experience, and he writes some really phenomenal pieces as part of a Substack that he has. It's The Informationist, if I remember rightly. Yeah, so James is a really good advisor into giving us some ideas on what we should and shouldn't be focusing on. We've got Pleb Music, Max. He has got a really cool little documentary series. He does a lot of media content for Saifedean, polishes up his podcast. He was doing all the audio work for the Fiat Standard Audible version. He does all our content as far as cleaning up our pods. He does all the graphics and that sort of stuff for us. So he's absolutely phenomenal. So we're just really lucky. And Dahlia has just come on board. So we're really lucky to have Dahlia Platt. She can be found on Twitter as well. And she has been involved. She's natively Spanish speaking. And she has been involved. She's got a very good educational background. So she's been a tutor and educator for many, many years. And she has offered to translate the course into Spanish for us. And she's giving us some really good insight into the educational stuff. So she's been helping us put some quizzes into the content, just to the learning checks and so forth, just to pick out those really key concepts that people really need to hone in on. And she's going to help us reach that massive audience of natively Spanish-speaking people, and particularly, El Salvador. So she's going to be such a great asset to the team. And of course, we got Foss the Boss. So he's our networking guru. He again gives us a lot of advice and oversight into the industry, makes a lot of great contacts for us, and he's just been an absolute godsend for us to oversee the platform. So we're really, really lucky. And Bitcoin is just such a wonderful community of giving people. Like, we're all doing this for free. If we can retire one day and do this based on very subtle monetization of that thing, that's fantastic, but that's not what this is about. We have no immediate plans to do that. But like, so many Bitcoiners have just reached out to us just to say, we love this. So someone's reached out to us and offered to translate it into Turkish. So another guy's come out and said, I'm a media producer, I'd love to contribute if I can, and it's just all about education and people just giving up, their time and knowledge to further, it sounds a bit cliche, but further humanity in this way where we can educate people about money. And that's what, is so transformational, what a sound money standard can do for everybody, absolutely everybody.
I think Bitcoiners are really good at that, rallying around an important cause, even if it's at sacrificing their own time, money or energy to do it. And it sounds like it's a really well-rounded team, and there's some good tweaks or good additions to it in future, with maybe leveraging it with some more video content, like you said, language translations, even having a couple of points where there's a few queries just to sort of check knowledge. Is there an intention to put out further courses as well, like maybe drilling
Absolutely.
down into each of those kind of investment? Because I think, there could be one specifically on bonds, couldn't there? Then one on stocks, and one on property, and then one on Bitcoin, even one on gold or something like that. Is that sort of the plan? Is to maybe not in that order or whatever, but
yeah, the next importance is going to be a Bitcoin specific course. So with the Bitcoin course, there's going to be two parts to the Bitcoin course. So the first part is going to be all about the ins and outs of Bitcoin itself. So you've learned about Bitcoin. You've heard about Bitcoin. You come into this course, you go, I want to know about Bitcoin. And it's basically just going to give you the ins and outs on mining, nodes, the 21 million, the 210,000, the 10-minute blocks, the block rewards, etc. The second part is going to deal specifically with helping people with the FUD. So you've made the choice to, a few of the narratives around Bitcoin, some of the things that it solves, some of the things that it helps, like its integration in the energy space and the mining space and so forth. And also just give you a little bit of the, what we feel is you need that conviction because of the volatility. When you choose to make the Bitcoin investment, obviously, we're going to tell people the best way to do that through dollar cost averaging is the best way to get exposure. And when you have, typically, if you're going to make a big investment in Bitcoin, you're going to see a 10% drop the next day, because that's just the nature of you're going to want to puke your bags. You're going to want to sell out. So it's all about helping you get those narratives to think this is okay, this is normal. Over time, that volatility irons out, and you're taking the right approach in order to deal with that. And when you see the WEF come out with FUD about energy, you know where to look for that FUD busting conviction, which is what you need to, so you don't sell out of your position at the exact wrong time. And that's like so well orchestrated as well, and so well evidenced that these FUD pieces come out at conveniently the right time when markets are starting to sell off,
Yeah, like if you spend enough time in Bitcoin, you almost expect it, even though sometimes the level that it goes to is surprising. But it doesn't faze me at all anymore. It's like I'm very zen about it. As in, like, it doesn't faze me in the sense of like being concerned about Bitcoin or wanting to sell my Bitcoin. It phases me in the sense of like how ludicrous it is.
Yeah.
And I need to talk about it and how ridiculous it is. But otherwise, I think, once people get a bit of reassurance, once they've stayed in for long enough and seen it go down and then back up, and seen it have, some of the very big movements up where it goes to a completely new level that never comes back down from, I think people just need to be through one of those cycles, which is usually a halving cycle. And that is what locks them in, for majority for the longer term.
Absolutely. And just to get back to the question about the other courses, so that's going to be the first next course that the next focus for us. We're also looking at ways that potentially we could further educate people if they wanted to, say, come to we could leverage off some of these conferences around the place. We could run a 1 or 2 day session, because there's a lot of people that go to those conferences, which I wasn't aware of, that are completely new to Bitcoin. So they're coughing up the money. They're interested to go along, but they still don't know any of the fundamentals behind what it is and how it works. So we're looking at different ways of that. We're also in talks, where everything's open on the table at the moment as far as where we want to take this. So we're even talking about converting the course that we've got in the Bitcoin course coming up. We're in talks with some people to look at making that a school curriculum, and basically that'll be targeted at high schoolers. And we're also looking at, I know there's been a few really good children's books out already, but we're also toying up with different ideas about that. And it's all just about getting these sound money financial messaging out to people, and we will do that in any way, shape, or form. So the children's books idea was a really good idea, as far as how would you get a grandparent potentially to start questioning some of these things about money. And if you got a children's book, they're going to read it to the 3, 4, 5-year-old. The 3, 4, 5-year-old's not going to know what you're talking about. But if you can make it entertaining and have that underlying learning, then you're benefiting. Maybe the grandparent goes, what's that about? What are they talking about there?
And I reckon kids don't have much of a filter. And I think sometimes they can be more logical than adults. And so maybe 3 or 4 years old might not be it. But once you get, a little bit older ages, by older age, I mean even 5, 6, 7, I feel like some of the very simple explanations of what money is meant to be, like a representation of our time and energy, and our time and energy is scarce. Therefore, you need a scarce money that no one can manipulate. That it's going to be like, yeah, that makes total sense. Of course you would. And then, of course, when you introduce how the money actually works, that's going to be just full of questions of like, Mom, Dad, why? Why is it like this? Why can someone control it? Why do we have more than we had yesterday? When you know what I mean? I feel like kids without their filter will absorb that and then start looking at the world and saying, this just doesn't make sense. And no one can seem to answer me in a logical or rational way where it does make sense again. I think that's great.
And why shouldn't we be helping from a young age to, by the time they reach adulthood and hit the world of working, if you're addressing a 3-year-old now, by the time they're of working age, perhaps these issues don't exist anymore, because we've managed to change fundamentally, and they'll grow up just knowing Bitcoin was the way money worked.
That's right. I mean, there's so much research around disrupting. In the extreme case, like the cycle of poverty, is really all about education. I don't think we've been educating people with the right things so far, which is clearly why we haven't had a whole lot of, success with that. But I think financial education at a young age is necessary, similar to emotional education at a young age. A lot of the things that we get taught in primary school and high school, completely irrelevant for most people's lives. If we just took it back to basics and went okay, how does the world work? How does money work? How do taxes work? How do, investments work? And maybe you don't even need them if you have good money. Getting people to learn these things from a young age, I think would just be revolutionary in a nice, peaceful, really productive way.
100%. Well said.
I think it's great what you're doing, and I've already offered my help to ever look over course content, or if you need another contributor and you feel like there's a topic that I might be able to chip in at, I'd love to do it. I think it's just a great initiative, and I can see, the scope that you guys have and the way that it's sort of expanding, all the different mediums you might target, all the different age groups and everything else. Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I can see this just becoming like this runaway train in such a great way. Where
it's already getting
it's the education people need.
So much traction, so much interest. It's just been really, really overwhelming and really rewarding already. Because it took a lot of effort to put that together, that course together. And our goal is to become basically the one-stop shop for timeless education pieces. So we're not interested in talking directly to the latest bit of FUD or what might be happening in this country or this country. It's all about trying to create that timeless education and that place where people go. It's like, you know what? I don't know about this. I know where I can go to start looking. And just building that. And that's going to be over time. And we will totally take you up on that, because contributions are going to be a big key piece to that. So yeah, by all means, we'd love to have you on board, mate, for sure.
That's brilliant. And I guess unless there's anything else to talk about with the education part, we might as well shift gears a bit and talk a bit about Bitcoin mining.
Giddy up.
So I think we don't need to cover any of the basics, like what is Bitcoin mining? Is it good for the environment? How much energy does it actually use? I think there's plenty of information out there that covers some of those very basic topics. And in fact, in the upcoming course that you have that drills down into Bitcoin, it sounds like there's going to be a lot of that information. So what I wanted to talk mainly about was Bitcoin mining for a home miner. So I am embarking on the journey of home mining now. For people listening, we're probably going to talk mainly about the S9, or I guess ASICs that are at that same kind of level of as an S9, rather than say the newer models like S19s, which would probably require upgrades to your electrical system and whatnot. So I guess something that a lot of people will probably get prevented from getting into mining by is the profitability. And so I wanted to just talk at least briefly about, is mining still profitable? Because this is a myth that stopped me getting into it for a very long time. I've dabbled now in hosted mining and now know that it's profitable. However, the risk of that is kind of not something that I want to stomach long term. So those miners will be coming back to Australia, towards the end of the year and so forth. But for the home miner, where we are getting Australian electricity rates, like what's your perception of, is it still profitable to do?
So I hate to start this off with it depends.
And the answer is always going to be that.
It really does, mate. And so unfortunately for us in Australia, most places that I've looked at, so I'm in Queensland, and I'm pretty sure most states are very, very similar in their price structure. So at a normal tariff rate, mining with X-gen or old generation miners typically is not profitable unless you can offset that energy cost in some way, shape, or form. So there's got to be a lot of caveats involved in that decision. So if you were to just go and buy an S9 miner, the good thing about S9 miners versus S19, so S19s will cost you upwards of $10,000. They were as high as, depending on where you want to get them from, I've seen them as high as $22,000 from an Australian source. A few months ago, they were still attracting 16,000 sort of Australian dollars for one. I've seen them come down in price just recently, which is actually surprising considering we've just, I think today, hit an all-time high hash rate. So there's still demand for miners. But an S19 is profitable with our baseline energy costs, no matter where you plug it into. Now, if you want to mine with an S19, you will be profitable from home. You will get away with one S19 plugged in. You've just got to be a little bit careful about where you plug that in, because they are very, very high current draw, and you will exceed a double GPO. So most people have a double GPO. A double GPO, all that means is a general purpose outlet. It's two sockets on one faceplate. If you plug that S19, they come with two cords because they're so much high power. They split that power between two cords. But if you plug that into your normal standard GPO, they're rated for 10 amps. And S19 from memory is going to draw about 14. So you will probably melt that GPO. And if you have other circuits, other things on that same circuit in your house, like your dryer or your oven, or your oven will be on a separate circuit, your fridge or whatever, you will more than likely trip that breaker. So tripping a breaker is not necessarily dangerous. That's exactly what they're designed to do, is trip when you are in an overload condition. And like I said, you just have to be a little bit clever about, ideally, if you're running an S19, you would choose two separate GPOs on two separate circuits in your house, and you'd be okay to run that S19. As soon as you go to two, it becomes a bit more of a problem, because now all of a sudden we're going to exceed the breaker ratings. So that's why S9s make a bit more sense to run from home, because you can plug them into any standard GPO. They come with one cord. They're only going to draw about 4 or 5 amps from memory. So they're a lot lower in power rating. However, they don't mine as much. So an S19 is typically going to mine at, and without, I don't know if you want to get bogged into what hash rate actually means, but it's 10 times as powerful, an S19, for 3 times as much power in rough figures. So an S9 is 1.2 kilowatts, but it's only about, you can push them with the right firmware to about 14 or 15 terahash per second. So an S19 is 104-ish terahash per second. You can push them a little hotter. An S9 is typically 11 out of the box. You can push them to about 14 terahash. But the advantage is they're very low cost. You can get them secondhand, landed in Australia, more than what you'll see overseas, but typically I've had a couple land here anywhere from about $850 to $1,000 per miner. And for me, I'm happy. I'm lucky. Don't get me wrong. This is going to sound a little obnoxious, but I'm happy to write that off as just not even a capital cost. It was just an educational thing for me to buy. I've got 3. I'm just probably about to pull the trigger on a 4th one. Unfortunately, one's not operational for various reasons, but I've got, so basically what I'll end up with is out of 4 of them, I'll end up with 3 operational is the hope. And basically they can be profitable provided you can offset your energy cost. So that's where you've got to, ideally most, it's pretty common to have solar on most roofs these days. So if you can utilize an existing solar connection, you can offset some of the costs for this to running S9s. Now, this is where it comes, how much solar do you have? What area of Australia are you in? What's your typical solar hours? It's a terminology that they use within the industry to say, how many hours do you typically get of sunlight on average per day where you are located? And obviously that depends. It's all weather dependent. So there's a few variables that need to go in there, but it can be profitable. And I'm happy to talk about my setup at home if you like, and just some figures with
absolutely,
just to demonstrate that. So my mining, so I've got 6.6 kilowatts worth of solar panels on my roof.
That's exactly the same as me, actually. Yeah, 6.6 kilowatts and 11 kilowatt battery.
Yeah, okay. So I've got a slightly smaller battery, 10.5 kilowatt hours. Yep. So 6.6 is a typical household size because most grid connections will limit you to 5 kilowatts export. So that's a maximum export. So they normally go a little bit hotter on the roof, so they're always going to generate at least the 5 kilowatt. Oh, well, not at least, but sort of on a good day, it's going to generate 5 kilowatts, and you can export that to the grid. So the advantage of the setup that you and I have is that we are charging a battery. So when we're at home, and it's a nice sunny day and we're generating solar, my home use is priority. So it will use whatever I'm consuming is the load that is obviously consumed. So I'm not importing any energy from the grid. And then anything I'm not using real time that is getting generated from the solar charges my battery. And then the idea is you have enough capacity there to charge the battery full. So when the sun goes away or the sun goes down at night, then I'm sucking that battery dry and I'm largely self-sufficient off my own energy production, draining that battery. And then when that battery runs dry, I draw back off the grid. So that's my personal setup. Now, we're pretty heavy power users. I'm in far north Queensland, so it's pretty hot and humid. We got air conditioners running. We got fridges. We got, a couple of freezers for backup meats and all that sort of stuff. So we're pretty heavy power users. And I've done the numbers. And for me personally, I don't like to run my miners all the time. That is just a decision that I made because it's a trade-off between what we use versus how much I'm charging my battery. And I've got to account for the fact that if I'm not charging my battery full, it's actually costing me more money at night to use my normal power consumption. If I'm if I'm utilizing that energy to run a miner and I'm not charging my battery. So that's my personal circumstance. But what I do use them for is we go away a fair bit. So we've got a caravan and we like to go away. And I don't like to export any energy to the grid because I get nothing for that export. I get about 7 cents per kilowatt hour. And I think my last bill, my export resulted in me getting about $8 for a month for the export. So I would way rather be utilizing all of that and hash as much as I can. So when I do go away or we know we're not home, I'll normally fire the miners up and utilize all that generation. So if my typical arrangement is I'll run 2. So they're 1.2 kilowatts on average each. So that's 2.4 kilowatts. And that's enough basically for me to run most of the day, charge that battery when I'm not home, deplete the battery, and then I'm drawing off grid. So they will run 24 hours a day. There are ways you can get a little bit clever if you wanted to automate that a little bit more. So, you can, set them on timers, just like your normal, you can buy them from Bunnings, just a normal dial timer. and you can make that turn off at midnight if you wanted to, and click back on in the morning. So you can organize those sort of things. But I just run them flat stick, and away we went. So I've just recently gone away. So we went away for a couple of days over Easter. So we're away for 8 days, and I've just got some figures before we come on today because I knew we were going to be talking about this. So running 2 S9s for that 8 days, I stacked, where is it? 107,000 sats. Okay, for a total AUD costing at 55,000 per Bitcoin for about $59. So that's $59 that I got 107,000 sats I stacked basically for free. Well, probably not for free because there's a few calculations that I've got to go in there, and I was sucking off the grid. But basically what that meant is it cost me $7. I was earning the equivalent of $7.40 worth of Bitcoin per day. And it cost me, I've got a little bit of a breakdown here. It cost me a little bit more actually. So, and it depends on how many solar hours there were during that time, which is really hard to model when you're not home. So I've got a little bit of a breakdown here, but it's basically profitable for me, or worthwhile time anyway, because I'll talk about this little premium that I put on my KYC stacking, which we got to think about as well when we stack non-KYC Bitcoin. But
definitely,
it's profitable for me to do that on based up to around 5 hours solar day. So if I only had 5 hours worth of solar generation, it's still worth my time doing that to that level.
That's pretty good, because that's going, at least where I am, is going to be the vast majority of days in summer and the seasons either side of it.
Yeah, and I guess we will just quickly touch on that. So I like to put a little bit of a premium on that non-KYC. You know, it's an important thing to highlight. So, you know, if you're stacking Bitcoin that's not touching an exchange, then, you know, that does attract a little bit of a premium to me, just because I can basically allocate that wherever I like. If I want to send that straight to an orphanage in El Salvador, I can do that.
And it does actually attract a premium on the market as well. For a lot of, if you're really patient, you could probably get it for maybe 3 to 6% higher than normal market rate. But if you want to make a quick stack, you're paying upwards of 10 to 20% more sometimes for no KYC sats. I think the other thing that I've thought about quite a bit with this is that we always do these calculations based on Bitcoin's current price.
Exactly.
Whereas if Bitcoin doubles from here or goes 5 times or 10 times, and I'm confident that will happen, it's just a matter of time, I'm not going to sell the sats that I mine. So even though at the moment it looks like I'll be mining at a loss perhaps, or even maybe break even, or sometimes it might be profitable with the offset of solar, I'm confident in 10 years' time, I'll look back and be very happy with that investment. And especially once we get to 20 years, 30 years, 40 years' time, that will be far more than my investment in terms of like the grid cost and the initial outset for the miners, which I'm the same as you. I see it more as an educational thing rather than a capital expenditure or something like that.
100%. And you can look at it as a way to dollar cost average as well. So even if it is costing you a little bit of a premium to stack those sats, if you are dollar cost averaging anyway, why not just dollar cost average into Bitcoin? So if you're running one of these and you can get cost for a full day for one, I think rough figures about $6 a day to run one, and you'd be making about $3 to $4 worth of AUD Bitcoin. But as you say, it's that stack, and what else that buys you, stacking that long term into the future. Having a nice little non-KYC stack for your retirement is not a bad idea.
Absolutely. I'm curious, you mentioned that you will, sometimes you'll switch them off unless you're out like camping or something, then you just sort of let them run 24/7. Is there any downside in terms of the life of the equipment for like ramping them up and ramping them down? Or are they just, it's fine to turn them off, turn them on, depending on your convenience and usage?
They're one of the probably, and that's why they're playing a big role in this energy space, is they're a very easily dynamic load in that way. It's just like a normal computer. So to my knowledge, I'm sure probably versing ramping them down and to everything that I've looked at, it doesn't hurt them at all in order to, and they're very quick to ramp up. I think they take about 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most, to be pretty much up to full hash. And the interfaces that you get with these, you can monitor them. You can, so I've got them in the shed. Probably the biggest drawback, which is worthwhile touching on for people considering this at home, is they are loud. They are.
I was going to say, could we give like an equivalent? Is it sort of like a leaf blower or like a woman's hair dryer, but like 50% louder than that or something like that? Does that sound like reasonable?
Louder than a hair dryer. Probably equivalent with a leaf blower, not as bad as your lawnmower.
Gotcha.
Does that give some?
That's a nice scale. I think I like that.
Yeah.
I mean, if people are really curious, you can always go look at some YouTube videos because there's plenty of people, showing their soundproofing, and then they take the soundproofing off, and you can hear what an S9 sounds like. So,
and it's been my experience as well. So I've had a couple of these arrive with standard firmware in them. And I believe it's the case that when you plug these things in with standard firmware, those fans on them, they're pretty hardcore DC fans, and they will run full noise. So they are one speed on, and they are significantly louder than if you put custom firmware like Brains OS on them, because Brains OS will actually map the temperature for these chips, and they ramp the speed of those fans proportionally to maintain that constant, steady temperature on those chips, because there's an optimal operating temperature for these chips to get the most output and the most hash. So the fans will regulate. So the downside is they tend to surge a lot more. So it's a lot like a static noise. It's more like if I'm going to do this on the pod,
you can hear it ramping up.
It's like a ramp up and ramp down. Whereas if you just have them full noise, it's just really loud, but a constant loud, if that makes sense.
It does.
And so there are options like you yourself, we've spoken offline about some of these boxes you can build to help. There's mufflers you can put on these things. There's a whole heap of different. I just run them. So I'm in a standard block in suburbia. I run them in my shed. So I've got quite a large shed, 5x6 shed, and I'll run them in there with the door down. And I live in North Queensland. I have run them a lot over summer, and I haven't had any issues. So in saying that, humidity's not kind to electronics, never is, never will be. And that's also why I'm happy not to have a $16,000 piece of equipment in my shed in that environment, because if I did have a $16,000 piece of equipment, I'd probably be treating that a lot kinder.
True. That is actually a good point, or at least you've sort of raised a good point in my mind, is what sort of maintenance do they need? Do they need to be cleaned out for dust? Is that, and how regularly would you do something like that?
Yeah, it's probably a good 6 to 12 month sort of cycle. They're fairly low maintenance. You can just let them run, but they will collect dust. They're just like your computers at home. If you notice, they do get gunky. They are sucking in air from the environment across those hash boards. So those chips are basically, there's two fans, one sucking air in, one's pushing it in, and one sucking it out, kind of thing. So you will get dust. They're very easily maintained though. There's basically 4 screws on the end. You take the fan off, and each of those hash boards are just slotted in, so you can just pull them off, get a little air compressor, blow the dust off those chips. And if you do that, you're going to be helping yourself, because if you do that more regularly, I would suggest more often the better, because they will get it, dust. And the longer you leave it, the harder it's going to be to clean. But also, the more crap that they get on it, the less ability they have to dissipate heat. So if you're keeping them clean all the time, then you're going to be basically, maximizing your opportunity to produce hash.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back a couple of steps when it comes to the like plugging them in, to put it simply, you mentioned with the S19, they'll have 2 different power cords, and you're better off plugging them into different circuits. Is that there's only one power cord with the S9? However, if you had, say, multiple S9s, like 2 or 3, would you then be trying to put them on a separate circuit from the rest of things in your house, or even maybe split them across different circuits each, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So two on one circuit would be fine, because that's only about 10 amps, and then you've got enough headroom. So it depends on your home installation, but it's typical to have 16 amp breakers on power circuits, up to 20 amps. But as soon as you start putting 3 on there, you're probably encroaching upon nuisance tripping. So all you're basically going to do is just annoy your wife, because she's going to be wanting cooking dinner, and you're and you're tripping her frying pan off. Trust me, it's happened. that's fine to do if you've got a couple. If you wanted to expand your operation at home and have a few more S9s, then you do have to have that consideration. Basically, to sort of summarize that, S9s, if you've got two S9s on one GPO, perfectly fine.
Gotcha. Perfect. And what I was going to ask as well, can it share a circuit with other things? As long as you don't have it sharing a circuit with like a bunch of other things, like a fridge and a kettle and other things that have that really high ramp up sometimes.
That's a really important point. So it depends on that load. But typically you could share that on one circuit. And if you did have nuisance tripping while you're doing things like on heavy, I would avoid loads that I would avoid your kitchen circuit if you can help it, and I would avoid your laundry circuit. So if you somebody uses your dryer, typically everything else in your house is pretty low power. Anything that heats and cools is a problem. Air conditioners normally have their own dedicated circuit, so you don't need to, for most modern homes anyway. Older homes you may need to reconsider, but avoid your kitchen circuit because you've got kettles, you've got microwaves, they're quite heavy loads, your fridge as well. And try and pick those, and they're pretty easy to pick if you needed to, is just simply have something plugged in, hairdryer or something, and then go out the front and then flick it off at your switchboard, and that'll discriminate against your circuits. So you can go around your house, plug that hairdryer in, you can soon map out what's on what circuit. That's an easy way,
like a bit of a process of elimination.
Exactly. That's the easiest way to do it if you're not an electrician, you don't have a multimeter.
Another question that's related to circuitry or wiring, but not so much about the electrical part, is so Ethernet cable is obviously the ideal because then you have less latency. And when it comes to something like Bitcoin mining, you want that data getting there as quickly as possible. Having said that, if it is in a place that is more difficult to wire, or if it's just going in temporarily before you can have kind of new outlets dropped and everything else, is using one of those Ethernet to Wi-Fi, I don't know what you call it, converters or adapters plugged into the back of it, is that noticeably different? I mean, have you ever kind of tested that out at all?
I actually haven't. It's been something that's on the back of my mind. I do personally use a Wi-Fi repeater out to my shed, just because it wasn't economical for me to run a dedicated Ethernet circuit. Particularly, and also with Ethernet circuits, they're not lossless either. Over long distances, typically 100 meters is fine, which would be okay for most domestic settings. But I don't know whether that is actually having an effect on my scoring hash or not. I haven't noticed it, put it that way. But again, I haven't done any of the sort of due diligence to see that that's all getting through. They're pretty low data usage units. They don't actually send a lot of data. That's a bit of a misconception a lot of people have, is that they're very heavy on the data because they're heavy on power. It's kind of like, it must be true, but I don't know off the top of my head exactly how much data throughput they need or have, but I don't think that's actually so much of an issue.
That's good to hear. Yeah, sometimes you hear, I guess, maximalists or extremists saying like it has to be hardwired. And I thought, I don't know. I know a little bit about networking. It doesn't seem like there would be that much loss. Or if it is, we're talking like less than a couple of % here, which means for the convenience of not having to like drop new wires and spend the money on that or do that myself, etc. If these things are located relatively closely to the modem, it's just so much easier having Wi-Fi as being the connector instead.
Yep.
In terms of where to put them, you mentioned that you've got them in a shed. I think depending on the house setup, something like that could work, just like having them sitting on a rack somewhere. What I'm intending to do is build the Steve Barber or Upstream Data, their black box design, and just using stuff that I can find at Bunnings, more or less. So if anyone is keen to know about that, I'll put a link actually to, I think Econo Alchemist has just recently done a relatively, comprehensive guide about what are the materials, how do you put it together. He's even got a video of that, explains why the design is the way that it is, because I think sometimes people have seen the design and gone like, oh, I can just put it in a box and put some soundproofing material in there. That'll work. But it's actually, the way that he's designed it is, it's called like this tortuous airflow path, which basically ends up having most of the sound absorbed by the time it gets to the outlet. So I think if you see that design and it looks doable, I would say go with that design rather than trying to come up with something yourself, because I've seen a lot of people go down that route of doing it themselves with just a plain box or something, and then it's way louder than what they thought, or they've dropped like 5 decibels from 70, which is just still incredibly loud. So that's my plan. I'll perhaps post up pictures and stuff as I go with building it, but I think anyone who's keen to build something to put it in, I think check out Steve Barber's black box design, because it's open source and you can do it yourself.
Yeah, you shared that with me not so long ago, and I'm pretty inspired to actually have a bit of a play with that myself. And the other thing I'll be looking at myself personally is immersion cooling. Just makes a bit more sense for where we are in the humidity and heat up here. And also, I haven't had any complaints from the neighbors yet, but I'm ruining the day that they go, what is that in the shed that's making that noise? Because it is audible. Even with the shed door down, I can hear it. It's not obnoxious, but it's definitely audible, particularly running 2. I haven't actually DB monitored. I've got one actually here because I do gigs on weekends, so I should actually go and see what the difference is, how much more it increases having 2 running, but it is noticeable. But immersion cooling basically gives you the opportunity to take the fans off. I have seen some designs where they do actually leave them on in order to help push that fluid through. But it's a little bit cost prohibitive in Australia yet. In the research that I've done, I've had some conversations with 3M, a rep from 3M who will be looking at that more because it's becoming a little bit more popular within data centers themselves. But the really good data center purpose it's quite cost prohibitive, particularly if you've got smaller scale sort of mining. I've heard some people tempted to use mineral oils. Working in the distribution industry, we have mineral oils for cooling solutions for transformers. While they are rated for voltages, they will eat PVC. So just a word of caution there. Not saying all do, but the ones I've had exposure to, and I've seen some people mention even vegetable oils and all this sort of thing. So don't muck around with it if you're not 100% sure. So yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. But that's definitely a good option for and also you can hide that a little bit better. You know what I mean? So you can have it in your study if it's just sitting in some cooling fluid, and there's different ways that you can cool that. But even just having it immersed in the liquid itself is actually pretty good. But then you've also other ways you can complement that by having little pumps and radiators and that sort of thing. So that's probably something I'm going to look at later in the year to just have a bit of a play around with.
Absolutely. It sounds really exciting, that space, because my understanding is that it'll extend their life because you have less moving parts, unless, like you said, you have the version where you keep the fan on. It gives you the ability to overclock as well in more of a sort of safe fashion because that heat is dissipated better. And yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, get proper dielectric fluid, whatever it's meant to be rated for, rather than going with a cheaper route. As the saying goes, you buy cheap, you buy twice usually, or you have to replace some stuff.
That's right.
I was into aquariums for a long time, so I've still got a few aquariums around the place, and I'm like,
right.
As soon as it becomes more accessible, I think I can repurpose one of these things into an immersion setup for sure.
That's exactly what the sort of setups people have been doing. The other thing you got to be just mindful of is some of those silicons. Mineral oils can actually eat the silicons. So I have had a friend who's just had a pretty I think he got a gaming PC or something, a pretty high spec GPU in a fish tank using mineral oils from the transformers that I was talking about earlier, and that silicon ate away. So he come home one day with his prized possession on the floor.
Everything covered in oil as well.
And that stuff stinks. It's not a pleasant. I've taken a few baths in my time in that through various accidents, and it doesn't smell pretty. It's a pretty it's got a very distinct smell.
Everything's got a trade-off.
That's right. And just on another point with you saying just different ways you can utilize that cooling system is there's another guy who's looking at making a pool heater. So going to divert the pool water in and around that heat exchange basically to basically heat his pool through winter. So if you're, there's all these innovative ways that people are looking at, having an S9, if it's not necessarily profitable, but you normally heat your home, it's still 1.2 kilowatts worth of power. That's current. Current creates heat. So there's a fair bit of heat that gets generated there. You may as well put it to good use.
Definitely. My intention is to have it sitting outside pretty close to the back door. That way I can vent it back inside during winter. My partner and I are pretty stingy. We very rarely use the heater during winter, but it gets pretty cold. So if we could just have that hashing, earning sats, KYC free, and then also heating the house beyond what we would usually do during winter anyway, that sounds great. Sounds like a luxury. Yeah, exactly. I've got one last query about mining before we move on to perhaps some speed reading and mind mapping.
Absolutely.
This is maybe just a bit of a funny one. I'm curious, has anyone had such a setup that creates enough heat and enough electricity use that it alerts authorities that something might dodgy be going on there? Like, has anyone have police rocked up to the door to be like, we think you're growing something or you're cooking something or you're doing something that you shouldn't because it's your profile is just like in the red flag zone?
I have heard stories actually. Nothing concrete, but I have had stories where police are using like thermal scanners of, particularly like in the UK. I think there was a story of a guy had a couple of S9s or GPU miners in his house, and they thought he was growing weed in his roof because it sets off such a high heat profile. And as they sort of scan through using the infrared scanners, that sort of stands out. There's like this house is artificially hot. So, get the knock on the door. It's like, okay, show us your weed crop because we know you got a hydro set up here. It's like, no, man, it's just GPU.
Show them these screaming machines. Like, what is this?
Yeah, that's right. Open
what
the
is
door
happening
and
here?
get smacked in the face with
just
noise.
Exactly. I'm just boiling the oceans. Don't worry about it. I'm not doing anything illegal. Oh, that's hilarious. All right. So unless there's any final points to make about mining that you can think of, I think that probably covered most of what I had in mind and queries that helped me get mine set up as well.
Awesome. No, I don't think nothing sort of comes to mind, but any plebs listening, I'm on Twitter. The DMs are open. If I've got a electrical and sort of energy space background. So if you got any questions, by all means, reach out. I'm more than happy to help. Nothing I love more than talking about Bitcoin mining.
But you've been very helpful for me so far. So yeah, anyone
Awesome.
who is curious and has questions, hit Daz up. I'm sure he'd be keen to talk.
There's a couple. I'll just plug some articles as well. They're not on Looking Glass yet. We're probably going to launch them over the next couple of weeks. But there's 2 articles on my Medium page. If you wanted to learn a bit more about the math behind some of those electricity principles and just how you work out currents, just some of the considerations you need to have. And there's 2 articles there. I think it's Bitcoin and Energy for Plebs, I think are the titles of them. You'll find them on there. So dig into those if you're interested.
Absolutely. Now, I'm just conscious of time. I've got kind of a hard stop in about 20 minutes, and I want to be respectful of your time as well. And that might kind of work well because that's about a 2-hour sort of mark. So I don't think speed reading is probably not a huge topic anyway, but I think it's an important one, right? Because I've been getting into this a bit more as time has gone on. And I think a lot of Bitcoiners definitely consume a lot of content. I see a lot of people with, their book suggestions and seeking more book suggestions. So if we can get to a point of helping everyone consume a bit more content faster, we're going to be all highly, highly intelligent people, more so than we already are. And look, I'll maybe just throw out my basic, what am I thinking here? Like tips of what I found useful. And this is just gleaned off of doing some DuckDuckGo searching and trying to find what helps. So I have initially just been speed reading with a book. And there's something called like the finger technique. So basically like moving your finger across the lines and just trying to follow your eye, to where your finger is. A really important point is don't go back. So if you miss something, just keep reading. You're reading an entire book, an entire chapter, an entire page. There's going to be context in there where you will understand the thing that you think that you missed. Because that can be very slow when you go back and you got to find your place again. And sometimes you miss it the second time anyway. So use your finger, at least initially. Don't go back. Sometimes it's good to scan the page initially just to see if there's any topics or headings that sort of jump out at you in terms of then letting you know what's going to come next. And keep notes. I've found it very useful. I did this anyway, but especially with speed reading is when I get to the end of a chapter, if I find something that's really salient, it's just note it down because that helps with my retention. Having said that, the version that you do is speed reading on steroids. And I tried it out just very recently with the Road to Serfdom. And I love it. It's definitely the way that I'm going to do it from now on. So could you, maybe explain to people how you go about it?
Sure. So I guess I'll just step back a little bit and I'll just add it to a couple of those because what you said was some really good points. So that's how I sort of come to this little hack is I started wanting to speed read. I had too many books on the shelf unread. They were just stacking up being in this space, there's so many good book recommendations. I have to read that. I have to read that. I have to read that. So I had, all these books on the shelf and I've got a really bad habit of not being able to put a book down, even if it's terrible. I'm getting better, but if I read it, I'm going to read it from cover to cover. And it was just a habit that I had. So a couple of the things that I'll just add to what you already, because those points are definitely a way to increase your speed reading. The one key thing, which was also the hardest thing for me, was to kill your inner dialogue. So when you're reading, it's very, very common for you to read the words aloud in your head and read each word, and that will inherently slow you down to the speed in which you can form words. And it's something I found really, really hard to break. So it's mainly scanning the words and absorbing the words, making sure you've got your comprehension, but that you're not actually verbalizing them. And the other key thing was one way you can start to teach yourself is also the finger method's really, really powerful, but also bring your margins in to where your finger actually starts. So you can start with a physical book's easier. You grab a physical book and you go one word in roughly. Obviously, they're all going to be different lengths, but you draw two margins down the side and you don't allow your eyes will pick up them on the peripheral. And then as you get good at that, you bring in another word, so that you are only using your eyes across a thin corridor, and you're allowing the periphery and your brain to actually map in those other things. Now, it turned out I was actually pretty terrible at all those disciplines. So, and it's one of those things, obviously, you stick at it, you're going to get better and better. And what I found, that I can't even remember where I found this. This wasn't my original idea, but I did come across it somewhere on the webs. So I'm typically a Kindle reader, because I will take advantage on any device that I've got. So if I've got a little bit of downtime at work, I'll be typically reading. So I liked that fact that you can use a Kindle, leave it at home, but pick up the app when you've got stuff on your phone, and it'll sync up and tell you where you are, and you can continue reading on. And then when you get back home, that will be up to where you're up to. The really key hack that I found was when you're at the checkout for Amazon, for example. Not that I advocate supporting Amazon. I think they're not very good. But anyway, you got to deal with what you got to deal with. When you're at checkout with Amazon, you can. There's actually an option in there to check out with Audible, the Audible version as well, and it's typically only a couple of dollars to add to your Kindle purchase. Now, just to add a little backstory there, I'm not a very big advocate for Audible on its own. I typically tune out. So I like to listen to podcasts and books and so forth when I'm at the gym, as a good example, on my commute to work, driving to work. But if I'm listening to it, if I've got a podcast, I can keep track of the conversation, no problem whatsoever, with minimal distraction. For some reason, I don't resonate very well with a narrator. So I couldn't always, just listening to a book was a waste of time for me, because I'd lose context and I'd go, hang on, I just missed that whole chapter or what it was about, and I'd have to go back. And I was just getting really frustrated with that. So in saying that, so the hack that I discovered was you buy the book, you check out at Audible, and then you listen to it while you read. So, and then you slowly push your, I listen to podcasts fast anyway. So I was sort of start off at 1.5, increase your speed to 2, 2.5 up to 3. And, the more comfortable you sort of push yourself over time to beyond comprehension, then dial it back. Push yourself to beyond comprehension, dial it back a little bit, and slowly over time, train yourself to be able to. And so as a good example, at the time when I discovered this, I was actually learning how to trade. And there was a book called Trading the Zone, I think it was called. It was about a 300 or 400 page book. And I read it in about 3.5 hours with a really high retention rate. So it was the first sort of time I tried it, and I did push myself pretty quick. And I was amazed by how easily I was able to read it, and how much I actually retained of the book. And I thought, this is it. This is how I'm reading. So there's obviously a big difference between reading for pleasure and reading for leisure, or reading for learning, rather. So, I typically only use this for learning books, but I have noticed that even the leisure books now are starting to trickle in to reading in a quick way. So the one further hack, so not all books I found had an Audible version. So there is one other app I paid for. It was a paid app. I think it's called Voice Dream. I'm just going to check that so I can tell everybody about it.
It is Voice Dream, because you sent it to me when we talked about this a while back. So yeah, I checked that out too.
So the advantage of the Voice Dream is you can put any format, so Mobi, EPUB, PDF, and so you can put anything that you come across that you want to read. So I read my Lynn Alden subscription articles. I put all them in there, and I do use this while I'm driving when I'm not reading, but I typically will get a lot more out of it if I'm reading if I'm sitting down and reading while listening to it. You just absorb it a hell of a lot, because it is easy. If you're only listening, you can get distracted and can tune out. But I've actually noticed I've been able to tweak that even higher, because the downside of the Audible version is you still had the narrator. And I don't always resonate with a narrator's voice, whereas this lady, or you can pick your own voice. It's robot voice, and it takes you a little while to get used to, but once you're used to it, you can just chew books down. Absolutely, so fast.
It's so true too, because speed reading, I did Sovereign Individual and Fourth Turning just with the book itself, and I got through them way faster than I would have previous books. And they're very difficult reads. At least I found them to be difficult reads. So I don't know if that was the best book to practice with or books, but either way, I got through them much faster. But as soon as for The Road to Serfdom, I tried that other method of like listening to it because I found it on YouTube. There was a kind of like an audible version of it, and the narrator was good enough to sort of engage with as well. Very, very quickly, within the first maybe hour or so of doing it, I was up to about 3.5 times speed to be able to just still retain it and actually get to the point where I was reading faster than what the audio was, and I was waiting for it to catch up, even just for like a couple of seconds. And I thought, I am reading faster than I've ever read before, and I've done this within the span of about an hour. I guess what I found as well is that I needed to take breaks a little bit more frequently. So I'd go for like 20, 30 minutes, and that's when my attention would maybe start to wander a bit. So I'd just have a 10-minute break, then come back to it, do another sort of 30 minutes, and then 10-minute break. And probably that's better for memory retention as well, not just, sort of concentration and in eyes and focus and everything else. So I think it's good to do that if you need it. But yeah, I burnt through that book way quicker than I would have otherwise.
And it's also really good. So I full advocate for note taking. So absolutely, wherever I can, whatever situation, I'll stop. Even if I'm at the gym, I'll stop, what I'm doing. And sometimes it's just even a quick copy and paste from that book in there, so you can elaborate on that note later on. So I always find your retention and your understanding of concepts and in drawing these maps, which we can get to in a second, is always better if you can use your own words. Don't just copy and paste a key thing out of the paragraph. Formulate your own verbiage around what it is you want to convey, and you'll get a much deeper understanding of the content by doing that.
Definitely. I think paraphrasing always helps. It's similar to when you teach something to someone that you've learned, you actually just solidify it so much better. And then it just sort of rolls off the tongue next time you do it, because you've really put it into your own conceptualizations, your own examples, your own words.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it's probably a good segue. Like Obsidian is the software that you use. I was talking to Brisket, I think it was just last week. I don't know, time's going very quickly, but yeah. And he mentioned towards the end, mind mapping, writing some stuff down, maybe preparing a book at some stage. And Obsidian was the app that he used based on your suggestions. And so, yeah, I guess you just, because the way that works, that would cluster, like or related concepts. So like if you're reading 3 or 4 books, and even if they have some like loose association, this will be an app that kind of like links those things together.
So it's a way of mapping your brain and organizing your thoughts. And I can't take credit for this. This goes to Seb Bunny, the other educator. So he's put me onto this, and it's an absolutely incredible thing. So I have always taken notes, probably a habit left over from uni, but I wasn't always efficient at organizing them. And there's a lot of times where you would write a note and you'd never revisit it. So Obsidian is an app. It's a free app, and will sync up amongst all your devices, and basically just uses text files as its formation. So it gives you optionality to write notes whenever you can, because you've always got access to some sort of note-taking app if you've got technology close by, and you can later sync it up. But what it allows you to do is start mapping thoughts. So it uses really good indexing and hashtags, and I forget the actual there's specific terminology. So there's a really good YouTube series that I'll send to you if you don't have it already, to put in the show notes, perhaps, if people are interested. It doesn't take very long.
Yeah.
Basically just a really good introduction into the power of mapping your thoughts. And what it actually does is the Obsidian's really good. It gives you this little mind map of all your thought nodes. So as you're like writing a note, it's like, oh, well, this reminds me of this or this thought. And if you start organizing your thoughts into key topics and hashtags, then Obsidian will automatically map those for you. And it allows you to then better organize your notes, because you can also reference and link into previous notes simply with a couple of keystrokes. So it's like a double bracket, and you start typing the idea of the thought, and it'll basically give you the index of all your previous saved notes. and you can start building out this map, and it gives you a really good graphical image of all these thought nodes. Now the whole premise behind this was, again, I'll send you the book and I'll send you the links because I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but there's a really good book that goes about smart note taking, and it talks about this Professor Lehman, I think his name was. He was an honorary. He was sort of given an honorary doctorate, I believe, so the story goes, because he was known for basically putting out a heap of philosophical content without having any philosophical degree. And how he done that was they studied about his note-taking system, and it's very, very similar to this Obsidian, where with your note-taking, you index them into certain ideas, and where you start to get a concentration of ideas, if you're indexing these ideas into a certain thing. So when you're looking at this visual map, if you see one node with a lot of connections to that particular idea, that's a really good place to start writing a book, because you've already got synthesized ideas within your brain, and it just helps you visualize where those node connections are. So you might sit there and go, you know what, I've got a lot of things about Bitcoin mining or Bitcoin energy. Maybe I write a book about it, or maybe I write an article about that. And you will notice that it's a really powerful way of tapping to those ideas. And what this gentleman who they were studying found was that he never had writer's block, because he was always working on 4 or 5 different manuscripts, and he would just focus on where these nodes concentrated. Now, he has an old analog system of using an old library cataloging filing system with those little A6 size cards. That's how he would notice. But when he's noticed congestion in formulating some of these ideas, that's where he'd start writing his next manuscript. And when he got a little bit of drawing a blank, he'd just move on to the next node. And then slowly and surely, it would develop more connections back to the other points, and he was always able to just continuously grow.
That's amazing, isn't it?
It is absolutely incredible, the power of the brain, but also the power of leveraging, looking at it, all those nodal connections, because they exist. All those nodal connections exist in your brain. It's just they're in the dark, because we can only process so much at the forefront of the brain. So it's all about tapping into those neural connections where those memories exist and those ideas exist.
It's true. And whenever I've had, say, like a writer's block when doing an assignment or writing an article or something along those lines, it's the drafting process that usually breaks the writer's block, because you just force yourself. I'm just going to put some stuff down. I know something about this. And as soon as you put one thing down, you're like, oh, that kind of reminds me of that other thing. Of course, now I've got an example about that. Oh, actually, there's a contradictory view on this other bit of research that I read. Okay, I'll put that in there too. And then before you know it, it's like, I have a whole theme here. That's my paragraph. Okay, and what naturally comes next? Like it's a very organic process, but you need to start somewhere. And by kind of having a mind map, you don't even need to then just force yourself to start drafting. You've already got it there. You can see the nodes. You can see where there's a lot of content clustered, and that's like the low-hanging fruit. And I do have several documents that are about, 150, 200 pages or more of notes that I've just kept in chronological order of different topics that I've learned over the course of my life. So I think I need to start going back and organizing some of those and just codifying them a bit more to put them into a better visual representation.
That's right, because if they're just time-stamped, they're lost in time. Whereas if you can start indexing them into certain concepts and certain ideas, then those ideas will coalesce, and you'll start formulating other ideas around it. And sorry, I had another point, but it slipped me.
They do that sometimes. This is the benefits of note taking and
taking notes. Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Just come back to me. That's good. So the biggest challenge with it is just discipline. But if you can break it down into smaller goals, so if you can just do 2 or 3 notes a day, just of different ideas, they don't have to be big notes, and they don't even have to be elaborate. But just that whole, like, you think about doing 3 notes a day for a whole year, you're going to inherently end up with a very big mental map of your brain and those connections. And then just obviously that habit's just reinforcing.
True. And look, even from a psychology perspective, because some people might be listening to this and thinking like, I don't want to write articles or books. This is like, why would I do this? There is a benefit to journaling. There's a benefit to just recording, what's going on in your life, how you're thinking, feeling, profound things that you've come across, whether something that someone said or something you've seen or read. Those are all useful things to document down. You have no idea what could come in handy at any point. And it's just good to keep a bit of a record. I mean, time flies as we get older, and it's nice to sometimes look back and be like, that's what was important to me then. That's what I was focused on then. And oh shit, I've actually learned quite a bit over this time. I do have something to give to other people.
Absolutely. And it's good to reflect on, like, how powerful would it be if we were able to see the thoughts that were going through your grandfather's mind during World War II, you know, and arguably
Definitely.
we're going through some really profound change in society, with money, with health. You know, so I've been able to document some of these, and, you know, I just think it wild that in perhaps 20, 30 years, my kids will pick this up and go, geez, Dad was a tripper, you know. what was he thinking at the time? So, you know, that is, you know, they may read it, they may not be interested in it, but, you know, having it as an option.
That's very true. I think it's always good to keep, just documentation of the crazy stuff that's going on in the world now. I mean, it's good to keep documentation regardless, but especially because of what's going on now. And things do change rapidly. You know, we could have an up day or a down day, and it feels like it's always been like that. But then you go back over your notes and you realize, like, no, there's been other good moments, or there's been learnings, or whatever it might be. And especially, to pass that on to your kids, the next generation. I think that's.
And I think,
very useful.
And it's also, you'd obviously be able to speak to this better than I, but I think Tim Ferriss highlights it in the 4-Hour Workweek book as well. It's a therapeutic process to put down your thoughts, because something that's really eating at you, as soon as you have to formulate it into words, it kind of puts a dampener on it, where you're like, you know what, that wasn't as bad as I'm making it out to be in my head.
Absolutely. There's a concept called diffusion. It's just putting a bit of distance between you and the thought. You know, having a thought is much more activating than saying, at the moment, I'm having the thought that X, Y, and Z. Like, there's a couple of steps of separation there now, and you've named it, which means you've tamed it to some degree as well. And it might explain why you're feeling a certain way or why you're doing a certain thing, and that gives you some kind of corrective action to take. So yeah, very, very true. Very cathartic as well, I guess. It's just, you know, it's a nice release to sometimes write things down.
Absolutely.
That's really cool. I think this is a lot of stuff for people to go on with, get into a bit of mining, get into a bit of mind mapping and speed reading. And look, if you haven't checked out the Looking Glass Education course, that might be one of the first things to start looking into and noting down. So I think, thank you so much for your time. This has been probably very educational for everyone. Lots of different topics there, which is really cool.
It was really good, man. And, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the chat very much.
I've been really keen to have this, and we booked it so far in advance. It felt like it was just coming up in a week, and then it's like, no, it's like still 4 or 5 weeks away. So I'm glad it's finally here and we've done it.
Awesome.
And look, as time goes on, especially with like Looking Glass and any other things you do kind of in your personal pursuits, keen to get you to come back on, and we'll touch base again and just sort of see where things have sort of transitioned to.
That'd be awesome, man. Always happy to talk the corn.
Indeed. Likewise. Well, again, thank you very much for your time. Thanks everyone for listening, and until next time, catch you then.
Thanks, Justin. Good on you, buddy.